So, today I want to talk about the fact that poor people deserve good things. Right now, there's a situation in the United States where a ton of people are in extreme debt for a number of different reasons, whether it be student loans or back paid mortgage and rent payments, or just any other credit card debt that they've used to try to maintain their livelihood. And furthermore, you have people struggling from a combination of pandemic, lack of stimulus, loss of jobs, medical bills, and so much more that could just be going wrong in people's lives. And even with the federal eviction moratorium being moved to September, there's still this like looming crisis that this bubble of debt that's being pushed off further and further and further into the future is going to just burst at some point. And with so many Americans being in these places where they're choosing between food and medicine and rent, I want to remind people that poor people and people who are suffering right now still deserve to have good things every now and then. And I want to talk about this from a few perspectives. The first is the perspective of the self, the need to reward, and the guilt that often comes with it and how that kind of manifests. The second thing I want to talk about is stigma, specifically conservative stigma, but stigma in general, because I feel like that stigma is spread to a large chunk of the society about how to view poor people. And last, I want to talk about the paternalistic behavior of government institutions when it comes to giving poor people money and how that affects poor people in these situations. So, with that said, let's start with the self. So, when a person ends up in poverty, the first thing that they'll learn is that poverty is a lifestyle of denial. You have to constantly deny yourself things that you see, things that you previously had. And there's a sense of loss, especially if you're someone who's just recently entered into poverty. There's a loss, a grieving period that one must go through where they have to take account of the fact that they no longer have not just the luxuries that they might have had and that they may not be fully available to replenish. But sometimes in many situations, it's basic necessities that start disappearing. And that in itself can be a very traumatic experience. And if you're someone who's lived with constant poverty, you already know that there's a situation where every single day you live in a reality where you see other people have things that are just outside of your reach, whether they be the most luxurious status symbols or sometimes the most basic necessities of life. You are constantly seeing that shoved in your face over and over again that you don't have it. And so that stuff gets internalized. And it gets internalized in a number of ways. Um, Usually it gets internalized in a way that is dealing with stress and trauma and exhaustion. But sometimes it can manifest even in a form of guilt. So I want to talk about those. The fact that poverty is stressful should be apparent based on everything I've said so far, but also just based on what it feels like to not have what you need. Like just not having the basic necessities of life, being in a position where you're shuffling food and rent and everything else feels like a stressful thing. You're constantly shifting budgetary funds from this place to this place, figuring out which credit card you have to pay off first. These things can be extremely stressful. And so sometimes the best way to deal with stress is to give yourself a reward. It's to reward yourself for overcoming that stressful situation. And so the occasional situation where you want to maybe give yourself a treat, reward yourself a meal, or give yourself just something good, something to make the day feel a little bit better, a little more rewarding. Maybe it's even something as simple as a bubble bath. But then you have to pay for whatever gives you that bubble bath. And that ends up feeding a feedback loop of stress and trauma and exhaustion triggering guilt. And so where that comes from is that guilt often manifests in the form of, well, if I buy this nice thing, everything else could go wrong. It went wrong before because I didn't save enough, because I didn't do enough. And you start to blame yourself in a lot of cases for the situation that you're in, even if it could be something like a pandemic and a loss of employment that has you in a situation where it's quite beyond your means and, your ability to control. And I don't think something like wanting to buy yourself a small treat or buying your kid a toy because you want to see the joy on their face. Or, in the worst case scenarios, what if you're just so burnt out and tired and exhausted from the stress of being poor, which does happen, that you're just so mentally out of it that buying a meal gives you that night off to keep you going and to keep you moving forward, because you just don't even know how you'll function to make food that night if you don't. And you need the food to eat. So you're in this like really rough place where you're deciding how to manage not just your financial situation, but your trauma, your stress, your exhaustion, and then your guilt. And again, if you're in this type of poverty, you probably don't have any sort of health care to deal with all of this. And this is not helpful or given through the entire experience of being poor. Nobody teaches you this. This is just skills you're supposed to pick up and learn, and you're supposed to know the second you enter into poverty. And so the battle within the self can be very difficult. And again, one of the ways to deal with that is to reward oneself occasionally. So the second position to look at this from is stigma. When you're constantly in this place, people from the outside obviously notice. They notice that you're in a place of poverty, and a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about it. So there is generally a belief in the United States, and this harkens to very conservative perspectives that I'd argue come from around the Reagan administration, but probably existed way before this. But the way that it's been framed and in modern times with the mythos of the welfare queen or other attacks on receiving welfare, it really does come from that era. When people received that kind of care back in the 1930s and 40s through the FDR administration, there was a lot less stigma attached to getting government assistance because people just accepted that everyone else was kind of struggling and they wanted to see their fellow human being lifted up out of their situation. Nowadays, I think it's a lot worse in that particular regard. So again, there's this idea that people need to like lift themselves up and need to just completely deprive themselves of every bit of joy until they rise out of their current economic situation into a better one. And there's a constant position of judging the poor, and it's things like not giving homeless people money or not being comfortable with the fact that a poor person has a nice thing. And so I want to break this down in two different ways. One is what happens when you are seen buying a nice item for yourself from someone with this type of perspective. And two, how does that person interpret you already having nice things if you had just entered into poverty? So generally speaking, from what I've seen, what I've experienced, and what a lot of the people I know have experienced, and a lot of this is all anecdotal because at the end of the day, what do we have but our stories to talk about with this? There's not really a conglomeration of ideas talking about the trauma and, abuse of homelessness and being in places of poverty. We have to kind of rely on our, own stories and our own narratives and kind of a collective situation in order to address some of this. So you'll often find that people try to budget the money for you. They'll tell you how to live. They'll tell you, oh, you're trying to buy that item? Please don't buy that. Buy this alternative item instead. It's better for you. And they try to speak to you in such a way as if you don't know what you're doing and as if you don't or shouldn't have control over your own financial situation. As if you've somehow done something to deserve being in that spot. And again, this cycles through all of this. The idea that you belong in this place, and because you're here, you no longer deserve good things. And it's this self-perpetuating idea under capitalism that makes it so that people in general are not able to really lift themselves out of a lot of these situations because we constantly tear each other down instead of recognizing the common struggle amongst each other. And I think systems like socialism might actually, be the way we need to go to start undermining a lot of these conservative perspectives that have really started hurting people. In this particular case, you get cases where, people are judge and jury over what you're buying. If I decide that I have the means in this particular moment and I need this thing for my own mental health, for any number of other reasons, who are you to tell me what I'm spending it on? And in the other case, where you already have good stuff, sometimes you'll get questions like, well, why do you have that fancy car? Why do you have that fancy phone? Why do you have a tattoo if you're poor? Why do you have kids if you're poor? I've heard that as well. And, one, sometimes kids happen. Sometimes they're not planned. That is a thing that happens. Two, sometimes you buy those things or obtain those things beforehand. Does it make sense to try to sell your really expensive car in favor of a worse model that'll break down consistently if you're in a situation where everything else is going wrong in your life to make up the difference? Is that really where we should be cutting funds and looking at how to balance things? And I find that a lot of people who try to give advice are not coming from a place of genuine concern and, this is how you can actually balance your budget and this is how you can actually take care of yourself. It's coming from a place of, I'm going to tell you what I think's best and not really having the experience of dealing with poverty to back it up. And so I think that when it comes to stigma, people really need to shut up and just let people do what they think is best to manage their situations. And again, if that means buying a nice thing every now and then, or taking care of yourself in ways that are, considered necessary, then we should let them do it. And the last area that I wanted to discuss is the government's response to a lot of this. So the government is extremely paternalistic when it comes to handing out money to people. Oftentimes describing exactly how people are allowed to spend their money. One of the issues that went into the stimulus debate that just went on is there was a discussion of whether or not people should get direct stimulus payments to spend as they needed, or if it should be funneled through programs. And funny enough, it was mostly the Republicans, but some Democrats, who were talking about funneling it through certain programs, certain state-run institutions in particular, that would direct money. So it would go through unemployment, it would go through rent relief, direct rent payments, and it would go through food stamp programs. Basically, you may use this particular money as we see fit. What this does is it reminds people that it's not their money, that their money comes with an asterisk to it. And one could argue, well, if somebody's in this situation, shouldn't we be directing the money? No, because the person's already might have paid maybe their rent, but then you give them a rent assistance for something they don't need. And they really could have used the extra money to maybe stock up on food for a few months. People are not going to just waste their money on things. There might be some populations that might need assistance in that regard. I can't speak to that. But then cater this not to the average American citizen, but to specific cases of individuals. And that might be beyond the scope of this, like I said, but that's how you handle that. Don't treat every single person as if you need to paternalistically tell them, well, you can only get rent assistance and you can get unemployment assistance. And that isn't even counting the fact that some states have been mismanaging the money and some money never actually makes it into people's hands. Direct assistance was the best method that people could have taken during all that. And then I want to talk about now food stamps, since I mentioned it before. Food stamps is a weird one because food stamps has a lot of asterisks to it as it comes. Sometimes to get forms of food stamps or SNAP payments, you have to be working And you have to be in a situation where if you are not working, you have to get into some sort of job training program immediately. And so that in and of itself comes with a lot of barriers and struggles. And I think that whole discussion is kind of beyond the scope of this video, but just be aware that even to get the basic necessities of food stamps comes with an entire stressor. And if you're dealing with the anxiety and the trauma of having ended up having to be in a place of self-denial and guilt and shame for months and months and months and months, and you're just forced into a workplace without any medical care and any therapy and any understanding of what you've just gone through as traumatic, that can be really difficult. And food stamps in general, when it is given out in this manner to people who are employed, is not a subsidy for people. It's a subsidy for the company. So basically what's transpiring here is that people working for a company are in a situation where they can't get a living wage because the minimum wage is too low. So the government comes in and says, all right, you're not paying your workers a minimum wage, or rather a living wage. So we're going to subsidize them with some food money. And we're going to tell them how they can spend that money. Either raise the minimum wage and make the private company do it, or just hand them money. Because they may not need the money for food in that particular month. Maybe they want to handle it differently or pay down debt or pay other things. But it's, again, a restriction because the government doesn't trust and needs to paternalistically tell people what to do like they are children. And furthermore, to make matters worse, there have been some states, even though I don't believe they've been passed, who tried to regulate, like New York, what could be put in food stamp funds. So things that were considered too luxurious, like I said before, you might have a situation where a person wants to buy a luxury item and has managed their money perfectly well. Say a person's been buying ramen and rice and beans and really, getting through, and they just want just a nice lobster dinner because they remember what that felt like. This type of bill would have prevented people from buying lobster on food stamps, making that impossible. If the person's able to manage their resources, then I don't think it's a problem. It's only an issue when they're not managing their resources. And then we should be providing trainings on how to do that rather than paternalistically controlling people. Another state that did it was, I believe this is West Virginia? Yeah. West Virginia had proposed a similar restriction on such things. And so the next case that I want to look at is disability. Disability in certain instances has made it very difficult for people to be able to save money and try to get themselves out of poverty. If you're disabled in certain programs in the United States, you are only allowed to have up to $2,000 in assets outside of certain special requirements. Thankfully, in 2014, under the Obama administration, one of those assets was a $100,000 maximum account, a bank account called an ABLE bank account that people could set up in order to save money for things like education, housing, transportation, and job training. Before that, however, it was impossible for people to really lift themselves out of certain situations if they were disabled. There was no way for them to be able to control their own finances. Furthermore, the terrible part about this is that even in this situation, you still are limiting people on what they can spend that ABLE bank account money on to education, housing, transportation, and job training. And it's still a very paternalistic system telling disabled people how they should be spending the cash that they're receiving in federal benefits. At the end of the day, things like this just wouldn't happen under socialism and anarchism. The belief that people don't have the ability to control themselves, the idea that people who are trying to work or trying to make a living should have to depend on a job and should have to depend entirely on, their situation when they're not even paid living wages by their companies. All of this could be addressed in further leftist systems. And if you don't want to go that far, I'd say one of the best ways to handle this is a UBI. Having a universal base income could be a potential solution to make sure that people have adequate care and rest when they're overexerted or when they have a issue like going through trauma or other situations. People deserve to have good things. We shouldn't be denying people in the richest country in the world. The United States has an overwhelming amount of wealth. And I don't think it makes sense to punish Americans who are near the brink of, poverty and to losing everything, especially when we see that situations that are quite out of Americans' controls, like pandemics, economic recessions, that the financially wealthy cause by, taking advantage of people and causing bubbles to burst, or just even a series of bad luck situations like healthcare costs or car payments or loss of jobs or any number of other things can just absolutely destroy lives in an instant and cause a lot of trauma. At the very least, we should be advocating for a UBI as a way of assuring people that they have a safety net, and this will help avoid stigma, trauma, and, yeah, actually allow poor people to have nice things every now and then. I think it's important, both psychologically and emotionally. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.